So I am delighted today to talk to you about FORCE11, an organization that is the future of research communications and e-scholarship. And I put my affiliation up here as the executive director of FORCE11, which I am, but I'm primarily a professor of neuroscience at the University of California, San Diego, so I've been feeling a little bit like a wolf in sheep's clothing at this conference for the last couple of days, in that I'm not a publisher and that I approach this very much from an academic point of view. However, the idea behind FORCE11 is that it is a grassroots effort to accelerate the pace and nature of scholarly communications and e-scholarship through technology, education, and community. And a lot of people, that's the FORCE part, but people say, well, what is the 11? And the 11 is that the whole organization, or the need for a FORCE11, was conceived in 2011, first because of a conference called Beyond the PDF, which was held at UCSD in January of 2011, and then a follow-on workshop in Darmstadt, Germany. And from that workshop in Darmstadt came something called the FORCE11 Manifesto, which was a document that was written by about 40 different people that laid out what they saw as the current roadblocks and needs in the current landscape of scholarly communication and what we needed to do to move forward. So it very much was a grassroots effort that came from the bottom up rather than the top down. And if one looks at who is FORCE11, one of the things that we tried to do for this was to make sure that it was including everybody who had a stake. So this was not just the academics, it wasn't the tool builders, it wasn't the publishers, the funders. It really was everybody who had a stake in moving scholarly communication forward. And we've tried to make it a big umbrella organization that understands that these different stakeholders have different points of view, and it is by bringing those points of view together that we can collectively move forward, because everybody has a role in this. But it's also true, even though it's heavily dominated at the executive committee by people in science, that we've done a lot of work in the last year to reach out to people in the humanities and social sciences, because a lot of the issues that are facing the future of scholarly communications really transcend any particular discipline. So even though I would give you my own point of view as to why I became involved in FORCE11, I think, which will be science-driven, we very much believe that this thing actually belongs to everybody, and we've got humanities, social scientists, computer scientists all on board. So the basic FORCE11 vision laid out, you can read the manifesto, which is a somewhat lengthy document, but again, it is this realization that slowly dawns on everybody who's in academia at some point that the landscape of scholarly communications and the possibility of scholarly communications really needs to break out of its paper-driven and paper-centric model. And that, of course, using the web as our metaphor, the idea that scientific information, scholarly communications really are global, universal, and should be linked together, that these are not silos, and the unit that we typically publish, which is the paper or the book, was never meant to stand by itself. It was supposed to be part of a much larger universe. And now we see on the web being able to link people together and link information together, that such a thing can happen, and that new forms of scholarly publication that work with these reusable scholarly artifacts, which are linked and brought together in different ways other than this unbreakable unit, which is the scholarly paper or book, need to start to emerge from what's happening. Now, we're not romanticists here. We understand that there are several things that are holding it back, and it's not just the publishing community, it's the scholarly community itself. And that in order for these things to happen, the reward systems and metrics inside the academy certainly need to be developed. And we heard that yesterday with the mid-sized publication. Nobody knows what to do with the mid-sized publication on a tenure committee. Nobody knows what to do with a blog or a piece of software either, and so these things need to happen. We also know, again, that there's a sustainability issue, that even though, as we'll see in a moment, there's been no shortage of people creating these tools and different types of scholarly artifacts, nobody yet knows what to do with all of these, and I think the data group in the other room is probably dealing with the same issue, especially when it comes to scientific data. But clearly, as I've gone through this process of learning about FORCE11, which I should say was officially established in July of 2012 with the grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, it was quite clear over the course of my career that the model of distribution and content had been changing, and it had been changing for some time. So even though if I had thought about this, I would have put these scholarly societies on this slide, the idea that you had a scholar who produced content and that got into the literature by agent of some peer reviewers who then sold that the publisher sold that content back to the libraries and the scholar interacted with the library, I realized somewhere between 1990 and 2000 I ceased going to the library altogether, and I ceased using the library as any mode of distribution of content, and so did everybody else. UCSD now allows food in its library, and I realized the reason why is because otherwise it was just a large empty building that no one would go to unless they wanted to take out a book. So everybody's patterns of use are changing. And I also realized in between the first Beyond the PDF and the time that I took over as an executive director that in fact scholarly communication had already changed. So even though we had the same three players with the scholar, the peer reviewers and publishers together in the library, in fact, scholars were already producing a lot of different types of content, and there was narrative, but there were workflows and data and blogs and wikis and linked data, nano-publications, multimedia, and code. And I deliberately made the slide look like this, but if you really wanted to know what the landscape was, is you saw that all of these things were going to different infrastructures, and you had code repositories and data repositories, and some of them talked to each other. But there were one big, I think, change that happened, and that's in the area of consumers that really, again, I think drive the idea of open access in particular. First of all, scholars were getting their content directly from the publishers and not necessarily going through or PubMed Central or someplace where they could get open access. And that consumer was no longer just the scholar, that there were demands coming from the outside of other people who wanted to be able to consume this content. And that's what I consider the human-centric view of open access. That is, taxpayers pay for this work and they want to be able to get this work and use this work, and not just the people inside the academies, but para-academics and all those outside, technologists, people even in industry who wanted this content. But the second biggest thing was the machine. And the idea that, again, we were producing millions and millions and millions and millions of these papers. No human being was reading these papers. Some agent was going in and getting access to it. And that agent had to navigate all of these different infrastructures. They had to navigate the many different publishers. And so consequently, we certainly understood that in science, the scientific corpus was in fact fragmented and fractured. And right after the first Beyond the PDF, I went off to work at a nonprofit for sabbatical called the Spinal Muscular Atrophy Foundation, which was a neurological disease of children, a genetic disease. And there were 5,000 papers, and I had a lot of offers at Beyond the PDF to use text mining to help look for pathways and possible druggable targets. And Elsevier offered their content, and that was 500 papers, and we had to go to Nature, and we had to go to Wiley, and we had to go to all the different places to try to negotiate to get access to it. And we realize now, again, that the unit of scholarship, particularly in science, is small, and it is only meant to be aggregated with everything else. It is never meant to stand on its own, and nothing that we do in our currently landscape of scholarly communication allows that to happen. So we have to really ask ourselves, and I think this is an important point, it's not whether the current method serves scholars. Well, we're certainly getting tenure and we're getting grants, so clearly we're doing okay in the system, and not whether it serves publishers, but whether we're serving science. And it's quite clear from the sort of rash of publications with retractions and other sorts of non-reproducible science that the current platform is not serving science particularly well. And we need to be able to rethink this, especially in neuroscience, where drug companies are running away from neuroscience at a rapid rate because there have been no major advances in the last few decades. Clearly, again, we as scholars have to say, are we serving our domain particularly well with the current form of scholarly communication that we have? So that was my particular motivation for getting involved. And what FORCE11 envisions, again, is that there needs to be a new platform for scholarly communications. This doesn't mean that there's one thing, but that the idea and the way that information gets into the body scholarly needs to change. And we recognize that there's different components to this. There's authoring tools, but authoring tools, again, that are optimized for markup and linked content rather than just creating a silo and a single unified monolithic work that can't be repackaged and used. That there are containers. We need to expand the objects that are considered publications, and that we should optimize the container for this content. Because right now, narrative still has a very important role, but it's not the only way that people can communicate, and it's not optimal for all types of content, thereby slowing down the process and not serving the content particularly well. There's processes. We recognize that especially in computational science, which increasingly is more and more, the code itself is the scholarship and not a description of the code. And that these markups and the ability to have suitable identifier systems so that you can have code repositories and data repositories in hundreds of different places, but as we heard from Roz, you need the identifier systems that allow you to look at these things globally. And of course, there are reward systems that allow you to change. So we really want to be able to move scholarship from the current single currency system to something, again, that takes much more advantage of the new technologies that are there. So what is FORCE11.org? Essentially, I said we've been online since about July 2012, and we currently have about 430 members, and we get more members every day. And first and foremost, it's a community platform that allows discussions and all of this work in this new landscape of scholarly communication to happen. So we run meetings. The Beyond the PDF meeting is our big one, and we just had that last year and we'll have it again. But there's discussion forums, there's tool catalogs, blogs, and event calendars, so a place to advertise the many different things that are going on in scholarly communications. And working groups, because again, we realize that there are many people around the world who are working, we need to bring them together. We view it as an education site, so that if there are scholars who are interested in these new forms of communication, we would like them to be able to come to the site and learn about what they can do now, and the same with anybody in this space, not just the scholars themselves. So I just want to go through a few of the things that FORCE11 is currently working on. As I said, we have the Beyond the PDF conference, and the last one was in Amsterdam in March of this year. And it's a fun conference, it's a wild conference, a lot of discussion. Everybody who goes really enjoys it because it's meant to be open and free-form discussion. And I think one of the interesting things about it, I realized quite clearly when I was at the last one, was that there's no wall between the publishers, the library sciences, and the scholars themselves. So normally they're behind the tapes at the trade show, but here they're brought in as first-class participants, and everybody participates on the panels and they participate in the talks because, again, we believe that everybody has a stake in this. It is an incubator for change. A lot of initiatives, FORCE11 itself, were launched out of these particular things, and we constantly harked at the last one. What would you do? There's a lot of opportunity out there, so what would you do now as opposed to just grousing and complaining about what needs to be done? We see that FORCE11 is a very interesting place to bridge these communities. As I mentioned, there are these different disciplines inside of academia, and we've seen that FORCE11 already has helped facilitate communications across these different disciplines. The issues are not identical. In some areas, for example, in the area of data, science is clearly ahead of the humanities, but in others, which are new forms of content and content creation, the humanities or the digital humanities are clearly ahead of the sciences. We brought up the ORCID ID. We heard about the Universal Author Identifier. The science community knows a little bit about this, the science publishers know a little bit about this, the social sciences say, hey, that's great, but it's not for us, and our computer science colleagues have never even heard of it. So clearly, again, there's opportunities here for dissemination and education. It's a resource itself for scholarly communication, so we've been gathering together the tools, we've been gathering together publications. We have a Mendeley reading group, we have a tool catalog, and that right now is somewhat nascent, but in the next couple of weeks, an upgraded tool registry which allows much better for people to rate and comment about their tools will be launched, because we think gathering together the tools that people are working on is an important step in understanding the landscape. And speaking of the landscape, we don't want all those arrows going here and there. We do think that there is a landscape of scholarly communication that's emerging, but there's nobody out there who's trying to think about it in terms of that landscape. But when you start to catalog tools, you cease to start thinking in terms of we don't have enough tools. You in fact see that there are hundreds out there, and there are more that come online every single day. But you start to ask yourself, so is it really that we don't have tools, or is it usable tools? Because a lot of these things come from academics, and we know the way academics create tools, which is an opportunity for industry. Or is that the tools are there and usable, but nobody uses them because they just never thought about it, for example, or do they not even know that such tools exist? And we see a lot of ignorance. So the idea is that as we're producing the tool catalog and also the community portal, that everybody will be placed in their context. And this will be people, this will be organization, this will be tools that say this is really where everybody belongs in this overall platform, in this overall world that we see. Because it may be that we already have a new platform for scholarly communication and nobody just connected the dots, and it's the connectors that need to be done. We also see that it's a place to come together. And we had, for example, recently a group, there was something that came out of Beyond the PDF called the Amsterdam Manifesto on Data Citation Principles. This is a big deal. How does one start to use data as a scholarly artifact? Well, it turns out there are probably 20 groups around the world who are also working on data citation principles all at the same time. This makes it very confusing for people to come in from the outside because you're like, well, I don't know, which principles should I use? Are they all the same? So we spent this summer, this was all volunteer, we have 35 individuals representing over 20 of these organizations, and we literally just took the principles that came from a couple of well-specified ones, put them side by side and said, where's the consensus? Where has everybody come together? Can we come up with just a few guiding principles instead of having to have people navigate this long landscape? Sort of like, again, copyright hub, right? It's not that you're stopping this work from happening, but you're making it easier to access. So next week at the Research Data Alliance meeting in Washington, D.C., we have 2 days devoted to presenting the work of this group and the Data Citation Working Group and coming up with a consensus set of principles that we will then disseminate broadly to make it easier, again, for people to navigate this universe. We also think that this is a place for action. So there's a very strong sense amongst people in FORCE11 that there's a lot that we can do already. And you know, I said, I've got my ORCID ID, I joined PeerJ, I actually experiment with and work with the materials that are there, I work with the tools, I try to create my content. Paul Groff does the same thing. So, again, why is a coordinating or cooperation organization needed? I think we know that there are new roles and vanishing roles. It's a very turbulent time. I've heard that expressed many times at this conference. There may be broader agreements that need to be forged, and I think universal access to the content of printed media is one of them that has to be bridged. However it's bridged, it needs to be bridged. And it's also quite clear that the issues are not same for all the stakeholders, and having a place where, again, if somebody's going to build a standard over here that could be tweaked slightly to be used over here, why would we not want to have that? Everybody is resource limited. So I always end a FORCE11 presentation with questions for you. Again, is your community represented in FORCE11? Are your needs the same as other stakeholders? What do you need from FORCE11? And what can you do for FORCE11? So we hope everybody in this room will join us. The next Beyond the PDF conference is being planned. And again, you can see that we're a very active group. Thank you.